For Holmes, coincidence had begun to look like design. The danger was no longer theoretical. Before traveling, Holmes asked Watson to bring his revolver. A firearm, he observed, could be a useful argument against a man capable of twisting steel. Holmes and Watson traveled by train to Leatherhead and hired a trap for the remaining journey. The Surrey countryside was beautiful. Spring had begun to color the hedges. Fresh shoots appeared on the trees, and the air smelled of wet earth. Above them stretched a bright sky scattered with white clouds. To Watson, the peaceful landscape seemed cruelly out of place beside the purpose of their journey. Holmes sat with his arms folded, his hat lowered over his eyes, deep in thought. Several miles from the station, the driver pointed toward a heavily wooded park. Grey gables rose between the branches. Stoke Moran. From a distance, the house appeared to be sinking into the earth. The central structure and one wing were badly decayed. Windows had been boarded over. Part of the roof had collapsed, and weeds covered the neglected ground. Only the inhabited wing showed signs of life. Smoke curled from a chimney. Blinds covered the windows. Scaffolding stood beside the wall, yet no workmen were present. Helen waited for them near the house. She was relieved to see them, but her relief vanished when Holmes explained that Roylott had followed her to Baker Street. Helen understood that her stepfather would know why Holmes had come. There could be no second opportunity. Whatever mystery existed inside Stoke Moran had to be solved before nightfall. Holmes began outside. Helen identified the 3 bedroom windows. The first belonged to Roylott. The middle window belonged to Julia's former room, where Helen now slept. The third belonged to Helen's original chamber. Holmes examined the supposed repairs and immediately saw that they were unnecessary. The broken wall had provided an excuse to move Helen. He then inspected the shutters of Julia's room. Helen closed and barred them from inside, while Holmes attempted to force them open. They did not move. The hinges were solid iron, built directly into the stone. No knife could reach the interior bar. No person could enter from the lawn once the shutters had been secured. They entered through a side door and walked along the narrow corridor. Julia's old bedroom was small and plainly furnished. A chest of drawers stood in one corner. A dressing table rested near the window. 2 wicker chairs sat against the wall. A narrow bed had been positioned beneath a thick bell rope, its tassel hanging almost directly onto the pillow. The walls were covered with old wooden panels, darkened and eaten by worms. Holmes sat silently and allowed his eyes to travel across every part of the chamber. He inspected the floor with a magnifying lens. He studied the wall panels. He examined the bed, then he pulled the bell rope. Nothing happened. The rope was not connected to a wire. It could not ring a bell. It had been installed only 2 years earlier, shortly before Julia's death. Helen explained that her sister had never asked for it and had never used it. The rope had no practical purpose. Its upper end had merely been attached to a hook beside a small ventilator. That ventilator was equally strange. Instead of opening to the outside, it connected Julia's bedroom directly to Roylott's room. Like the bell rope, it had been installed shortly before the murder. The arrangement appeared absurd. A ventilator that provided no fresh air, a bell rope that rang no bell, and beneath them, a bed that could not be moved because it had been clamped to the floor. The person sleeping there had no choice about where her head would rest. Every night, it remained directly below the rope and beside the ventilator. Holmes's expression darkened. The changes to the room were not decorative. They were components of something. Roylott's bedroom was larger, but equally plain. It contained a camp bed, an armchair, a wooden chair, a table, shelves of technical books, and a large iron safe. Holmes tapped the safe and asked Helen what it contained. She believed it held business papers. On top of the safe sat a small saucer of milk. There was no ordinary house cat at Stoke Moran. Roylott did own a cheetah, but such a tiny saucer would have been of little value to an animal of that size. Holmes then crouched beside the wooden chair and inspected its seat. The surface showed signs that someone had repeatedly stood upon it. Finally, Holmes noticed a short dog whip hanging near the bed. Its leather end had been curled back and tied into a small loop. It no longer resembled an ordinary whip. It resembled a tool for handling something. The safe, the milk, the chair, the looped whip, the ventilator, the useless rope, the immovable bed. Individually, each object appeared harmless. Together, they formed a pattern so disturbing that Holmes chose not to explain it until he possessed proof. His face had become grim. He told Helen that her life depended upon following his instructions precisely. That evening, after Roylott returned, Helen was to claim that she had a headache and remain in her room. Once Roylott had retired, she was to open the shutters, place a lamp in the window as a signal, and quietly move into her original bedroom. Holmes and Watson would enter through the window and spend the night in Julia's room. Whatever had produced the whistle would be allowed to return. This time, it would not find Helen alone. Holmes and Watson rented rooms at the Crown Inn, from which they could see the inhabited wing of Stoke Moran. At dusk, Roylott returned. His huge body towered over the young boy, driving his trap. When the boy struggled to open the iron gate, Roylott shouted at him and raised his fists in rage. Even from a distance, the doctor's violence was unmistakable. Soon afterward, a light appeared among the trees. Holmes admitted that the night ahead contained real danger. Watson understood that Holmes would not have mentioned it unless the threat was severe, but Watson refused to remain behind. His revolver might be needed, and his presence could prove invaluable. Holmes then explained part of his reasoning. Helen had said that Julia could smell Roylott's cigars from the next room. That detail had suggested a hidden connection between the chambers even before Holmes arrived at Stoke Moran. The ventilator confirmed it. The timing of its construction mattered even more. The ventilator had been created. The false rope had been installed. The bed had been secured to the floor. Then a woman sleeping in that precise position had died. The arrangement forced the victim to remain beneath a pathway leading directly from Roylott's chamber. Holmes still withheld the final detail. But Watson began to understand that the murder weapon might not have been a weapon in the usual sense. It might have been something capable of entering a locked room without opening the door or window. At 9 o'clock, the lights in the mansion went out. 2 hours passed. Then, at 11, a lamp appeared in the middle window. Helen had given the signal. Holmes and Watson left the inn and crossed the dark road. A single yellow light guided them through the trees. The broken estate wall allowed them to enter without using the gate. They moved silently across the grounds toward Helen's window. Before they reached it, something burst from a cluster of bushes. A small, distorted figure dropped onto the grass, twisted its long limbs, and rushed into the darkness. Watson nearly reached for his weapon. Holmes seized his wrist. A moment later, he recognized the creature. It was Roylott's baboon. The animal disappeared between the trees, but its presence reminded both men that the cheetah was also loose somewhere on the estate. They removed their shoes and climbed through the open window. Holmes closed the shutters behind them. The room looked exactly as it had during daylight. The narrow bed waited beneath the hanging rope. The ventilator remained a black square in the wall. Holmes placed a thin cane, a box of matches, and a candle beside him. Watson kept the revolver within reach. Then Holmes extinguished the lamp. Absolute darkness filled the room. The slightest sound could expose them. Any light might be visible through the ventilator. They could neither speak nor move. They could only wait. Minutes passed with unbearable slowness. The shutters blocked every trace of moonlight. Watson could not see Holmes, though he knew his companion sat only a few feet away. Outside, a night bird called from the trees. Once, a long cat-like cry sounded near the window. The cheetah was roaming across the lawn. From the village came the deep voice of a church clock. Midnight, then 1, then 2, then 3. Each quarter hour seemed longer than the last. Neither man knew whether the danger would come that night. Julia might have survived several earlier attempts before the final one succeeded. Helen might have escaped the same fate repeatedly without knowing it. The murderer's method required patience. So did the investigation. Then, without warning, a faint light flashed near the ventilator and disappeared. The smell of burning oil entered the room. Someone in Roylott's chamber had opened a dark lantern. A soft movement followed, then silence returned. Half an hour passed. Watson's eyes strained uselessly against the darkness. His ears searched for the smallest sound. Finally, he heard it. A gentle, continuous noise, soft and soothing, almost like steam escaping from a kettle. Holmes moved instantly. Holmes sprang onto the bed and struck repeatedly at the false bell rope with his cane. His face was pale with disgust. Watson saw the rope shaking, but could not understand what Holmes was attacking. Then came the low whistle, the signal Roylott had used during the previous nights. Holmes stopped striking. Both men stared at the ventilator. For one terrible second, nothing happened. Then a scream erupted from the room next door. The sound grew so loud that it seemed to shake the walls of Stoke Moran. Far beyond the estate, people in the village awakened in their beds. At last, the scream weakened and died. Silence returned. Holmes understood what it meant. The danger in Helen's room had ended. But something had happened to Dr. Grimesby Roylott. Holmes lit the lamp. Watson took his revolver. Together, they entered the corridor and approached Roylott's bedroom. Holmes knocked twice. No one answered. He opened the door. The dark lantern stood on the table with its shutter partly raised, casting a narrow beam across the room. The iron safe was open. Dr. Roylott sat in the wooden chair. He wore a grey dressing gown and red Turkish slippers. The looped dog whip rested across his lap. His head had tilted backward. His eyes were fixed on the ceiling. Around his forehead appeared a yellow band covered in dark brown speckles. For a moment, Watson thought it was cloth. Then the band moved. A flat, diamond-shaped head rose from Roylott's hair. Its neck widened. Its body tightened around the dead man's skull. The speckled band was a snake. Holmes recognized it as an Indian swamp adder, a creature whose venom could kill within moments. Roylott had been bitten before he could defend himself. Using the looped whip, Holmes caught the snake around its neck, lifted it away from the body, and threw it into the iron safe. He closed the door. The safe had never contained only papers. It had been the animal's cage. The mystery was finally complete. Roylott had known that ordinary murder would attract suspicion. Julia's door was locked. Her windows were barred. There could be no intruder. A visible wound, a conventional poison, or a physical struggle would expose him. But Roylott was a doctor. He understood anatomy, poisons, and the difficulties of detecting unfamiliar venom. His years in India had given him access to dangerous animals unknown to most English investigators. He had designed Julia's room around the method of murder. The ventilator created a passage between the bedrooms. The false bell rope created a bridge from the ventilator to the bed. The bed was clamped to the floor, so the victim's sleeping position could never change. At night, Roylott opened the safe and used the chair to reach the ventilator. He placed the snake through the opening. The creature crawled down the rope and onto the bed. It might not bite immediately. It might return without harming its victim. That uncertainty explained why Julia had heard the whistle on several nights before her death. Each night, Roylott waited. After enough time had passed, he whistled. The snake had been conditioned to return, most likely through repeated feeding. The saucer of milk formed part of that training. The looped whip allowed Roylott to handle the animal and return it to the safe. On the fatal night, the snake bit Julia. She awakened, struck a match, and saw only a brief image of the spotted creature withdrawing along the rope. In her final moments, she described what she had seen as a speckled band. The metallic clang Helen heard had been Roylott closing the safe after recalling the snake. The murder left no obvious injury. The 2 small punctures made by its fangs could easily be overlooked. The venom was unfamiliar and would not appear in the chemical tests available to the local doctors. Julia's death had preserved Roylott's income. When Helen became engaged, he repeated the plan. He invented repairs to force her into the same room. He waited until she slept in the immovable bed. Then he sent the snake through the ventilator. The whistle Helen heard had been his attempt to call it back. Had she remained in the room, she would eventually have died exactly as Julia had. Holmes's attack with the cane had driven the snake back through the ventilator. The blows had enraged it. When it returned to Roylott's chamber, it attacked the first person it encountered, its master. The weapon Roylott had used against Julia and intended to use against Helen turned upon him. Officially, the authorities concluded that Dr. Grimesby Roylott had died while recklessly handling one of his dangerous animals. Helen was taken away from Stoke Moran and placed under the protection of her aunt in Harrow. The house that had imprisoned her for years no longer held any power over her. On the journey back to London, Holmes reflected on the mistakes he had nearly made. At first, the gypsies and Julia's reference to a band had led him toward the wrong explanation. The evidence had seemed to support it. But evidence gathered too early could be deceptive. Holmes had abandoned the theory as soon as the physical arrangement of the room contradicted it. The shutters could not be opened. The door had been locked. The danger had not entered from outside. It had come through the only connection no one had considered suspicious. A ventilator too small for a human being. A bed that could not be moved. Holmes had not solved the case through a single brilliant guess. He had solved it by noticing that objects, without reasonable purposes, often possessed hidden ones. Roylott had believed his plan perfect. He had relied upon fear, isolation, medical knowledge, and the silence of the dead. But the very intelligence that made his crime possible had also filled it with deliberate details. And every deliberate detail left behind a clue. Years later, Stoke Moran continued to decay. Its broken windows darkened. Its empty rooms gathered dust. The villagers still remembered the scream that had awakened them in the middle of the night. But the truth was more terrible than the rumors. Julia Stoner had not been killed by a ghost. She had not been cursed. And no mysterious band of strangers had entered her locked room. Her murderer had been sleeping only a few feet away. Every night, he had opened an iron safe. Every night, he had sent death through the wall. And every morning, he had waited to learn whether his own stepdaughter had survived. In the end, Grimesby Roylott was destroyed by the cruelty he had prepared for someone else. His strength could bend iron. His knowledge could deceive doctors. His terror could silence an entire household. But none of those things could protect him when his violence found its way home. The whistle stopped. The locked room surrendered its secret, and the Speckled Band claimed its final victim.